Hi everyone, I'm Vladimir, and today I'm going to talk to you about whether we can describe the history of ancient Hebrew, biblical Hebrew in particular, at all, and if yes, how. So, as you may know, all languages change, evolve over time. So we all speak English, so English is a good example. The English of Beowulf will differ from the English of Chaucer, and in its turn it will differ from the English of Shakespeare, which of course differs from the English of the BBC that we hear every day or we read in the news. And with ancient languages, modern languages, it's quite easy because we've got native speakers and we use the language actively, so we can perceive quite easily as the language changes and develops. However, and this has also been done for ancient languages, I should mention. Biblical Hebrew is one example. This is the traditional chronology for Biblical Hebrew. So we have a classical Biblical Hebrew stage or pre-exilic stage. This is around the time of the monarchies, Israel and Judah, so before the Babylonian exile. Then we've got the transitional Biblical Hebrew or exilic Hebrew stage around the 6th century. So more or less after the Babylonian exile. And then we have the so-called late Biblical Hebrew or post-exilic Hebrew period under Persia, Greece, down to Roman times. And this is what linguists and philologists more or less agree about, this tripartition of Biblical Hebrew. However, Biblical Hebrew is an ancient language, is a dead language. No one speaks it anymore, so it faces three major challenges. As I said, no native speakers. How can we actually understand the different stages of Biblical Hebrew? The so-called textual fluidity of the main witness, the Hebrew Bible. So the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, was the text of a community that was in dialogue with the text itself. And so scribes would intervene, change, adapt, update the text. So it's hard to attribute a specific linguistic stage to the entirety of a specific book or chapter because scribes intervened and changed the text. And then we have very few datable inscriptions from the same period, above all from the pre-exilic, pre-Babylonian period, against which we can compare the language of the Bible. And those are more reliable, that would be more reliable data if we had it, but it's very little. So these are the three main problems that most biblical scholars raise when linguists and philologists say, yes, we can date the different stages of Biblical Hebrew. So how can we solve these problems? I would say that the second point, above all, textual fluidity, is not a challenge, but could be a point in favor. So we can use textual fluidity to confirm the so-called traditional model. Let's see how. So here is one example from a text that probably was written around the pre-exilic, early exilic time. This is 1 Kings, and this is the episode of the prophet Elijah and the prophets of Baal, and they're facing each other, and at some point we read, Adonai Eloi Avraham, Yitzchak, Yisrael, Hayom Yivada. So today may it be known, Ki ata Elohim Yisrael, that you are God in Israel. And that's one version. However, if we look at the second line, you have the translations, you don't have to know Greek or Hebrew, but in Greek, you can see that the text is much, much longer. In red, you can see that what in Hebrew we have as, today may it be known. In Greek we have as, listen to me, Lord, listen to me today with fire, and may know, I just follow the word order of the Greek, and may know all these people, and so on and so on. So we have two different versions, and this speaks to the so-called textual fluidity. Different versions, different manuscripts of the Hebrew Bible differ. And thanks to textual criticism, which helps us compare all these different witnesses in Hebrew and in other languages, we can reconstruct the earlier stages of a specific text. In our case, the ancient Greek translation that was made in Alexandria by the Jews of Alexandria in the 2nd century BCE goes back to a now lost Hebrew source. Whereas what we have in Hebrew nowadays, the Masoretic text, is actually a later edition. So the earlier edition of that text that we have in the Hebrew Bible is actually in Greek. So from a text critical perspective, we can see what comes first. And this is more or less how it went. So we can reconstruct the Hebrew behind the Greek, which is the first line, and then see how it changed and became the Hebrew that we have today. So I've just barred and highlighted in red the words that disappeared. And that's the text critical part. If we use the language, we see that this diachronic or chronological development overlaps with the text critical assessment, because what we have in Hebrew nowadays is a late word order. Hayom Yevada belongs to the post-exilic period as syntax, whereas in the earlier period, before the exile, if the text had not been modified, we would have had Yevada Hayom, because the jussive has to go in first position before the exile, and then it shifted under the influence of Aramaic. So historical linguistics helps us create this relative chronology also in the language. And so the text critical assessment of the text and the linguistic assessment of the variants overlap when it comes to relative chronology. So we may find in later editions, reworked editions of pre-exilic texts, late linguistic features, because the scribes would intervene and insert them almost automatically. And this is a quite remarkable result. Another example, and this may be more familiar to all of you than the Elijah episode, the story of David and Goliath. You may know it from the Hebrew Bible or from some translations of the Hebrew Bible. However, there are two editions that we have. One is, again, in the ancient Greek translation, and it goes back to an early short edition of the Hebrew text that is now lost. And what we find in our Bibles in the Tanakh is actually a later, longer edition that was reworked and has additions. So what you actually read usually is a developed form of the text. If you want to read the earlier form, you go back to the ancient Greek translation, which, as I said, goes back to a Hebrew parent text that is now lost. One example, again, Samuel, probably written before the exile. This is taken from one of those additions that we don't have in the Greek, but we have in the later form of the Hebrew text, Vayagidu lifnei Shaul. So the expression lifnei, lehagid lifnei, to say something before, belongs to the late biblical Hebrew period. If that text had been written before the exile, as the rest of the story, we would have had lehagid le. And this is part of a larger phenomenon where at some point during the exile and after the exile, under the influence of Aramaic, things started to happen before God. So you don't sin against le in Hebrew, but you sin before. You don't pray towards el, God, but you pray again lifne, before, and also with the verb to say. So another feature where we can see that the text critical development of the text overlaps with the historical linguistics assessment of the variants. And so to go back to the initial question, can we trace a history of biblical Hebrew? I would say yes, we can. And the traditional tripartition holds. And we can use one of those three criticisms that were moved against the traditional tripartition, textual fluidity, actually as a point of strength. So we can use textual fluidity and textual criticism as a method to compare the development of the text, the different layers within the text, and see where we find the variance. A late reading in an earlier text often reflects a late linguistic feature. So it betrays basically the intervention of the scribe. And that's a good starting point for a relative chronology of the text. And there are other disciplines that can both contribute to and benefit from this approach. We have literary criticism, reductual criticism, so how the books were written and modified, and history. So basically the outcome, the final outcome would be to better describe the cultural and religious history of ancient Israel, also thanks to the combined textual and linguistic methodologies. Thank you.